Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. And in this programme today, we will be discussing the evil and brutal murder of the Bibas family at the hands of Hamas. Poor Kfir Bibas, who was 10 months together with his 4-year-old brother, Ariel, was found to be strangled by Hamas, and yet what we see around the world is silence and no condemnation of Hamas. And in this programme as well, we'll also be discussing the annual figures produced by the Community Security Trust looking into Jew hatred in the UK, which sadly is at its second highest ever level. And we'll be asking, how can the church respond to this climate of Jew hatred? And in this programme today, I'm joined by my good friend and co-host for Behind the Headlines tonight, Pastor Tim Gutmann from the Christian Action Against Anti-Semitism. Good to see you, Tim.
Great to be here, and really important things that we need to discuss as well.
No, absolutely. So, Tim, can you just share a little bit before we just unpack the horrible horrors of what happened to the Bibas family and the CST report on anti-Semitism in this country? As a pastor, share with us your thoughts on this rising Jew hatred and how so important it is through your organisation, Christian Action Against Anti-Semitism, that Christians get educated on Jew hatred and understand how evil this is and how that we have to stand up against this evil.
Absolutely. Okay, so we were talking before about the number of pastors that are silent, you know, and it's such a key time in history. The levels of Jew hatred is at record-breaking levels. The last 2 years, 23 and 24, highest ever. But if you look at the trajectory, it's been doing that. And so many people are silent. But what they will do, and I think this is really important for believers, is that they'll quote Bonhoeffer, for example, and it's a quotable quote: "Silence in the face of evil is evil itself." And they'll look at World War II and think that's a million miles away. And they'll see what happened there and they'll think it's like almost like alien to us. And here we are in the midst of rising Jew hatred, where Jewish people feel unsafe, not just in London, not just in the cities, but in the UK. And more Jewish people than ever are thinking about leaving the UK. Now that is shocking. And it's, I think as Christians, you know, we have a debt of gratitude, I call it, from Romans 15:27. But actually we have a mandate, a calling: comfort my people, says the Lord.
Oh, absolutely. So let's remind ourselves of some of the horrific events that occurred last week. So last week we had baby Kfir Bibas, the 10-month-old Israeli hostage, and his 4-year-old brother Ariel returned to Israel in coffins. Sadly, their mother Shiri was not with them, and Hamas gave another body of a woman who was unidentified in a horrible ceremony in the handover of the Bibas family. And of course, this shocked and angered Israel. We've seen then that Shiri has now been returned a day later, under pressure probably from the US administration to deliver the body of Shiri to be reunited with her dead sons. We also see, for example, that the CST, the Community Security Trust annual report on anti-Semitism, is at its second highest level in 2024. And so I'll be asking, what does the future hold for the Jewish community, and what role can Christians play in comforting Israel and the Jewish people at this critical time in history? So we're also going to start with a very important scripture for today's programme, which is taken from Jeremiah 31 verses 35 and 36. It says the following: "Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, the ordinances of the moon and the stars for a light by night, who disturbs the sea and its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If those ordinances depart before me, says the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation before me forever." And I think it just brings some clarity of God's perspective, the biblical perspective on how he sees Israel. So the sun and the moon would not be working if God had replaced Israel and the Jewish people according to his elected calling.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the most basic thing here is God isn't a liar. So all of the promises he made, when he said this will be your land forever to Abraham, when he said you will be my people forever, I'm covenanting if you see the sun, you know I'm still covenanting with my people. And when it says in Amos 9:13, never again will you be uprooted from the land, it's very basic. God doesn't lie.
Absolutely. And share with us your thoughts, Tim, on seeing the news in Israel last week, where we saw the coffins of Kfir Bibas, Ariel Bibas, and then later Shiri Bibas. And of course, we have to remember that the grandparents of the Bibas family were also brutally murdered by Hamas on October the 7th. And of course, we've seen that the husband has survived, but he has no children anymore, and he has no wife.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, last week was really tough for me. Like many people watching, I prayed for the Bibas family every day, you know, and we know many children died, many elderly people, many children were murdered, many babies, many elderly of all ages. But there was something about the Bibas family, because they were, you know, there was this scenes where she's carrying her babies as she's being kidnapped. We knew they were still in Gaza, and so we were clinging on to hope and imagine what it was like for their extended family. And then to see the news, it was tough, man. It was like ripping your heart out, you know. The depths of evil, the wickedness, and then to see the response as well. I know we'll look into that, but it's been so crushing.
No, absolutely. So just to remind you, so on Sunday, the 23rd of February, the Jewish news syndicate known as the JNS reported an article under the following headline: Forensic evidence confirms that Shiri Bibas, not killed by an Israeli airstrike. One examination found no injuries consistent with a bombing. So forensic analysis of Shiri Bibas' body found no evidence linking her death to an Israeli airstrike, contrary to the claims made by Hamas. Her corpse was positively identified by Dr. Shen Kugel, the director of the National Institute for the Forensic Medicine in Tel Aviv, and he said the following. He said, "We identified Shiri Bibas 2 days after confirming the identities of her 2 young children, Kfir and Ariel." Kugel stated on Saturday, "Our examination found no injuries consistent with a bombing." It says that Hamas has long alleged that the Bibas family and her children were killed in an IDF airstrike in Gaza. However, the forensic findings contradict Hamas's report. They say, "We are met with depths of evil and malice that could not be conceived." And then on Thursday, the 20th of February last week, we saw that Hamas returned the bodies of Shiri's children, Kfir and Ariel, along with another elderly gentleman who's 82 called Obed Lafshit, who was actually then the 4th body that was released by Hamas, and believing that they had the body of Shiri Bibas, but they found that this was an unidentified corpse. And of course, what we've seen as well in this one is that we have the forensic evidence to say that, and this is the shocking news, that Kfir as well as Ariel were not killed in an Israeli airstrike as claimed by Hamas, but they were killed through strangulation. And to make matters worse, their bodies were mutilated with rocks to make it look like an airstrike. It just showed the level of absolute evil and depravity of the Bibas' captors, whether they're Hamas or whether they are ordinary general residents of Gaza. But this is a crime against humanity, isn't it? Because effectively what they are is baby killers.
Oh, it's hard to think of anything worse. I mean, the strangulation, the mutation of the bodies, and then the games they played with the corpses. And you will notice they put the babies in the same size coffins. It's all psychological warfare. I think they kept the coffins locked and giving the wrong bones for Shira. It's Nazi. It's the same spirit. It's the same spirit as Haman, as Hitler. You know, as the throughout history, these people that want to murder the Jewish people. It's spiritual. It's dark. You can't imagine anything worse than seeing a precious baby, and to harm that baby that has to be demon possessed.
No, absolutely. I can't imagine. I mean, a baby's there to be protected. A baby's defenseless. And to actually murder a baby with your own hands. I mean, not only do you have to have no conscience, but you have to be absolutely demonized to be able to do that. And of course, we wouldn't know what state the bodies are in. Only those that are working on Israel's forensic department would actually see that, but I'm sure they would be enough to shock anyone. So let's remind ourselves really of the shocking news that occurred last week when the Bibas family returned in coffins, and then we found out what really did happen to them, thanks to CBN.
Bombs exploded on 3 public buses Thursday evening in the central Israeli cities of Bat Yam and Holon. In what many believe was a miracle, the empty buses were parked and there were no injuries. The bombs had timers, and some suspect that they had been planned to go off during this morning's rush hour. Bomb disposal units discovered at least 2 other unexploded devices and other suspicious objects on public transport. Police are investigating it as a coordinated attack.
I can say that the situation is widespread. It's happening in multiple locations. We are spread out with emergency squads and with police officers in a great number of locations.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the IDF to carry out an intensive operation against terrorism centers in Judea and Samaria, where Israeli forces have been carrying out large-scale operations for months to uncover terrorist hubs. A Telegram channel claiming to represent Hamas in the Palestinian city of Tulkarem indicates it may have been responsible for the bombings. The message says, "The revenge of the martyrs will not be forgotten so long as the occupier is present in our land. This is a jihad of either victory or martyrdom." The explosions came at the end of a heart-wrenching day for the Israeli people. Earlier, Hamas returned 4 bodies, including 83-year-old peace activist Oded Lifshitz, 9-month-old Kfir Bibas, and his 4-year-old brother Ariel Bibas. The IDF said the children were brutally murdered in November 2023, a month after they were taken captive. This morning, Israelis woke up to yet another shock. The body that was supposed to be the boy's mother, Shiri Bibas, was not hers, nor that of any other hostage. President Isaac Herzog wrote on X, "This is a shocking and horrific violation of the ceasefire agreement, another cruel act by the terrorists of Hamas who continue to show utter disregard for humanity."
Today, the heavens shake. The entire civilized world should condemn these horrific murders. The entire civilized world should join Israel in demanding the immediate release of all the hostages. All of Israel is united in grief.
In an interview with CNN, Adam Bowler, U.S. envoy for hostage affairs, agreed it's a clear violation of the agreement and says Hamas needs to turn over the body quickly.
If I have one piece of advice for Hamas now, it's not only do you need to release her body immediately, but we have the bodies of 4 Americans that are still there, and we have 1 American, Don Alexander. He needs to come home. If I were them, I'd release everybody, or they're going to face total annihilation right now.
This weekend, Israel is due to receive the last 6 live Hamas hostages from the first phase of the agreement. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And we're so grateful for CBN's thorough research and investigation when they do their news reports on Israel, which is in complete contrast to so much of our mainstream's coverage when it comes to Israel's war against the genocidal terrorist organization that is Hamas in Gaza. So the Jewish News Syndicate also kind of reports actually what happened to the Bibas family on the 7th of October 2023. They say that Gazans terrorists stormed kibbutz Nir Oz. They breached the Bibas family home door using a drill and other equipment and entered the safe room where the 4 were hiding. Father Yarden reported the attack to his wider family in real time, texting that it feels like it's the end. We see that Shiri's parents, Yossi and Margit Silberman, were murdered by Hamas terrorists that day. The video of Shiri kidnapping and terrified and protecting her 2 children in her arms as she was surrounded by masked gunmen with weapons became a symbol of the October the 7th massacre. The Yardin Bibas was freed on February the 1st after 484 days in Hamas captivity, and now he knows the horrible truth that his wife and his 2 beautiful children won't be returning with him. Now, as a father, I know that you foster a lot of children as well. Just share the grief that Yardin must be feeling right now, and knowing that his beautiful children and also his mother, his wife, and the mother of their children is not coming home.
It's unfathomable, the pain. When he was released, you know, he probably expecting to see his wife and his children. He's probably been psychologically tortured as well in Gaza, talking about his babies, talking about his wife. But then to be released and to find out they're still captive, and the family were holding on to hope. So they were like, please don't do a eulogy for the children, don't do a eulogy for Shiri. We're holding on to hope right to the very end, holding on to this hope. And then the realization, it will be like I can't imagine it personally as a father, but you can see Yardin when he said this. He said, I want you to say and to tell what happened to my babies. I want the world to know the depths of evil of Hamas. There was no nothing of wanting to be private. He wanted the world to know about how evil that was. That's a father in pain. That's a man who's broken. He's lost everything. That's 3 generations.
And the nation of Israel is in pain as well. And the Jewish people as well have also taken this very badly as well. So I was actually surprised by a lot of media coverage, I think by mainstream media coverage. So last Friday I watched ITN's News at 10 report on the situation with the hostages, and yet they failed even to mention, they mentioned the Bibas brothers, but they failed to mention that Kfir was a 10-month-old baby that was strangled at the hands of their Hamas captives, that Ariel, his older brother, who was 4, was also murdered. And it was like, these are the 2 focal people of this entire story, these 2 children, and yet they didn't mention children, didn't even mention babies or anything, leaving the viewer watching that very confused about what is really going on here. And then also I listened to a bit of Radio 5 Live that same evening, and they were actually questioning the actual Israel's accounts, saying that Israel's forensic evidence say that they were strangled. We don't know that. It more looked like this was bombed by Hamas, by Israeli IDF jets that actually killed them. And so therefore more inclined to believe the Hamas lies and narrative than Israeli forensic experts.
And they've got a history of quoting Hamas as fact. And, you know, I saw a tweet actually by a BBC staff member that said he's sickened by the propaganda with the hostages by both Hamas and Israel. That's what he said. And this false equivalence, this attempt to reduce what's going on and to cover it up, to deceive actually the audience. The BBC as well, I read their article as soon as it happened. It said 4 people will be released today.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's shocking. Jake Wallace-Simmons from the Daily Telegraph, he said this: after what we've seen, how can anyone still sympathise with Hamas? The gut-wrenching scenes in Gaza are not enough to put off the useful idiots in the West. When you've got the BBC stirring up anti-Israel sentiment, and when you see what you see on the streets, they were still marching, by the way. They're still on the streets. I think on Friday they were on the streets doing this pretend funeral. I don't know if you saw that. It's sickening.
I also see that our Prime Minister Keir Starmer made a statement, and this is kind of reported by the Daily Telegraph and Jake Wallace-Simon's article, where Keir Starmer said that he was deeply saddened by the deaths, but his thoughts and prayers statement avoided naming the perpetrators, let alone condemning their crimes. And we see that the Red Cross has also participated in the grotesque showboating as bodies were released, likewise admitted the guilty party in a gentle plea for dignity and privacy, Jake writes. He said its defenders point to its operational neutrality. We point to extensive record of social media posts criticising Israel and bewailing the suffering in Gaza. They go on to say that Amnesty International, Jake quotes, it may be only to be expected, but that the formerly distinguished human rights organization opted that Hamas release of bodies of 4 Israeli hostages serves as heartbreaking reminder of the urgent need to immediately release all civilian hostages and Palestinian arbitrary detainees. Again, we see no condemnation. We see that the silence of international world leaders. We see the silence of NGOs who can't even mention the fact that this was a baby murdered in cold blood. Kfir Bibas. Just share with us the moral decadence that the West has got in for actually not even condemning Hamas. What is it going to take for the West to condemn a genocidal terrorist organization in Hamas that has committed the worst crimes against the Jewish people since the Holocaust over 80 years ago, and now they're baby killers?
I think the state we're in, this shows, October the 7th was a real wake-up call. The people like the Red Cross, straight away we were saying, why aren't they trying to see the hostages? Why aren't they condemning this from the start? Amnesty International, they represent something bigger. This is Western self-destruction. This is Western false humility, false concern. It's actually, to think about it, what we've seen is actually vile. The quoting of Hamas's statements, facts, figures, the constant questioning of Israel. It's kind of like a real, it's like the thermostat we're at as a nation, and where we're at with our young people in our universities, with all of that was going on in the universities. It's a real shock.
No, absolutely. So let's have a look now at this important news report put together by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and this is also the reaction of Israel's Prime Minister to the fact that Kfir and Ariel were brutally murdered at the hands of Hamas.
October 7th. Shiri Bibas and her babies were kidnapped alive. A mother's desperate attempts to protect her children. They vanished into Hamas's tunnels. Then, the horrific truth. Ariel and Kfir were murdered in captivity, torn from their mother's arms, and returned without her. Kidnapped together, they came back alone. Hamas is pure evil and must be eradicated.
Today is a tragic day. It's a day of boundless sorrow, of indescribable pain. 4-year-old Ariel Bibas, his baby brother, 1-year-old Kfir, and 84-year-old Oded Lifshitz were brutally murdered by Hamas savages. Their bodies returned home to a nation in mourning, a nation that will never forget and never forgive the evil that cut down these beautiful souls. Since that black day on October 7th, when Hamas butchered and burned 1,200 of our families and friends, Israel waited with bated breath, hoping beyond hope that our hostages would survive the Hamas hell. Against all odds, we succeeded to bring many home. Some we rescued, some we tragically couldn't. The Bibas children in particular became the symbol of who we are and who we're fighting against. Here's a photo of the Bibas brothers. These perfect children again were 4 years old and less than 1 year old when the Hamas savages snatched them from their mother's arms. She fought like a lioness to protect her boys. Just imagine their horror. Imagine their confusion. Perfect little children who never hurt a soul. A baby, for the love of God. They languished in captivity until Hamas murdered them in cold blood. Who kidnaps a little boy and a baby and murders them? Monsters, that's who. These Hamas monsters also cynically refused to bring back the boy's mother, Shiri, and sent the body of a Gazan woman instead, in brazen violation of the agreement. Today, the heavens shake. The entire civilized world should condemn these horrific murders. The entire civilized world should join Israel and demanding the immediate release of all the hostages. All of Israel is united in grief. And as the Prime Minister of Israel, I vow that I will not rest until the savages who executed our hostages are brought to justice. They do not deserve to walk this earth. Nothing will stop me. Nothing. Ariel, Kfir, and Oded, I'm so sorry we couldn't save you from the monsters who did this. We honor your kind and loving souls, so tragically cut down by evil terror. May your memories forever be a blessing and a reminder to all of us that we must fight this evil and eradicate it from the face of this earth.
And in this week's Behind Headlines, we're joined by David Collier, who's an investigative journalist in North London. David, warm welcome to Behind Headlines and great to see you on the programme.
It's good to see you, and I'm always obviously happy to come and join you on the shows.
And you've just recently made the news for your expose on the BBC's latest documentary on Gaza entitled How to Survive a War Zone. Share with us your thoughts on how the BBC is essentially giving airplay to Hamas propaganda.
Well, there's no doubt about it. This isn't something that we can argue about, discuss about whether or not it's biased or not biased. I mean, the show went out on Monday evening. By about 4 or 5 hours later, I began to uncover the links between the people on the show and Hamas. And when I mean links, I mean links. I mean, for example, the narrator, the main star of the BBC broadcast, his father is actually a minister or a deputy minister in the Hamas government. This is an official Hamas position. That's the main person on the BBC's documentary. So what we're dealing with is we are dealing with the BBC producing a propaganda documentary for a prescribed terrorist group.
And David, sadly, nothing surprises us with the BBC anymore, but share with us how producing and airing a documentary that is just pure Hamas propaganda is actually fueling anti-Israel sentiment amongst the BBC viewers, as well as causing many of the viewers to become anti-Semitic watching those documentaries that are literally produced by Hamas.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there are two main issues, and you just basically touched on one. Every other week, we have hundreds of thousands of people marching through London or wherever, waving the Palestinian flag, supporting extremists, and basically calling on for the destruction of the state of Israel. And you can't be surprised at that if our state broadcaster has been pushing Hamas propaganda for the last 16 or 17 months. That's first of all. There's a second question here. See, the BBC, they used this kid and obviously his father, and they ran around after him for several weeks. It wasn't like they filmed him in a 5-minute interview. It was over several weeks or several months to see his reactions to what was taking place. Now, he's 13 or 14 years old, which means the BBC had to have made an agreement with the parents. You can't put a child on camera without it. You've got safeguarding issues here, which means that there was direct connection. There had to have been a direct connection with the people that put together the BBC show and Hamas. And that raises the question, of course, of whether money changed hands. Was the kid paid for what he did? And are we actually in the position, and it's sickening to think about it, but it's a real position here, where our state broadcaster and our license fee has been used to actually pay members of Hamas so our state broadcaster can publish Hamas propaganda.
I think you found the smoking gun there, David, so thank you so much. And share with us your thoughts on the shocking news that occurred in Israel last Thursday when the Bibas family came home in coffins, and we saw the news that Kfir Bibas, together with his 4-year-old brother Ariel, were not only murdered by Hamas, but they were murdered through strangulation. And of course, their mother as well, Shiri, didn't actually return home with them on Thursday, but was later then delivered to the IDF on Friday. Just share with us the absolute shocking state of affairs where there's been very little media or world condemnation on Hamas for being baby killers and for strangling poor 10-month-old baby Kfir. It's beyond heartbreaking, and it's absolutely morally outrageous.
Look, I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't watch much of Thursday's circus, because that's what Hamas do. They put on a circus. As I've been avoiding most Saturdays, the weekly releases, I see myself in a fight, an existential fight against today's Nazis. And I know what they're capable of, and I know what they do when they get their hands on Jews. What they did last Thursday, I mean, we saw the results of in the slaughter, bare hand slaughter of little baby is more of the same of what they did on October the 7th and what they've been doing for decades. I mean, we know that Hamas terrorists have walked onto buses. I was in Tel Aviv once. It's Purim, which is it's a young kids Jewish festival where they dress up in fancy dress, and it's Hamas terrorists walks out into the street looking for kids in fancy dress before he kind of commits suicide. We are up against Nazis, and to actually, I don't want to engage in, immersing myself in what it is they're doing. I don't want to stop for a second. I don't want any weakness. I have an existential fight against Nazis, and that's just how I see it. So I get your question, but it's not something I at the moment have the luxury of being able to stop to address.
But David, are you concerned about the lack of moral courage that we're seeing in the West today? Lack of moral courage by our political leaders, a lack of moral courage shown by our broadcasters when they report the news on these things, that there is no condemnation of Hamas for their hideous baby killing of Jewish babies.
The weakness of the West is why we're here. We're not here because of the strength of Hamas. Hamas shouldn't exist. The Palestinian identity, as we see it today, shouldn't exist. The entire thing is built on falsehoods that, for whatever reason, the weakness of the West has allowed to grow into something that becomes real and all-pervading. I cannot begin to explain. As somebody who studies history, and I love the history, someone who studied it and looks at the growth of the Palestine movement and the falsehoods that basically are the pillars upon which the entire thing is built. Whether you're talking about the illusion of the two-state solution, or the illusion of the two-state solution, or whether the creation of Hamas, it's all part of the same weakness and the same blindness. It is an absolute insanity that Hamas exists today, or that we're somehow expected or required to treat it as if it deserves existence, because it doesn't. And the other side of the coin is how they're playing. It's that they act almost as if Hamas are aliens from outer space who have somehow come down and invaded Gaza, and those poor Palestinians have been invaded and they're controlled by Hamas. That's not what's happening, and our media treat it like 99.9% of Gaza are innocent civilians, and only if we catch that one man with a gun or with a rocket is he a terrorist. We have to understand we're up against a radical Islamic ideology that is pervasive, and that most adult Gazans, most of them, would have celebrated the 7th of October and would celebrate the slaughter of Jews, and were probably happy that those two little children were murdered.
This is the big wake-up call, isn't it? I was very surprised to watch ITN News on Friday at 10 p.m. They did a report on the plight of the hostages, particularly the Bibas family, and the journalist or the newsreader failed to mention Kfir Bibas being murdered by Hamas, and even failed to mention the fact that this was a 10-year-old baby and also a toddler with Ariel, who's 4, and just called them the Bibas brothers. Just share with us how even our main broadcasters can't identify what actually happened here, and that was the brutal murder at the hands of Hamas of these 2 beautiful Jewish children who were kidnapped by Hamas back on October the 7th, taken to that hellhole in Gaza, and then murdered brutally by their captors.
Well, look, if we look at the BBC documentary, and I'm bringing it up again for a reason, the co-producer, the co-director, the person who basically led it, because the other guy is just an English guy who doesn't speak Arabic, the person who basically controlled this is a Palestinian activist who was in Gaza himself 8 months ago, whose timeline is full of extremist fake news, anti-Israel activism and fake news. And this is, you ask, well, how were the BBC so blind as to think that he was capable of being responsible for a documentary? And this leads to what you've just basically asked me. Our media generally, well, you're talking about the ITV as an example. You could have mentioned Sky or the BBC or Channel 4. For a couple of decades now, they've been on a ever-decreasing, environment where they're employing people who used to work for Al Jazeera. They're enjoying Islamists who basically do not subscribe to Western or Judeo-Christian point of view at all. And slowly but surely, this poison has spread from within. And it's become so pervasive that the rest of the people inside these organizations can no longer tell the difference between a radical Islamic terror group and a liberal democracy trying to survive the onslaught of people that basically just want to destroy them. And that's the reality. So all of our channels are corrupt, all of them. And it's a long, long time since I've actually seen anybody give an account from Gaza or from Israel, and I thought, yes, they know what they're talking about.
David, finally, give us your thoughts on the latest Community Security Trust annual report looking into Jew hatred for 2024, where they actually revealed that the reported instances of anti-Semitism in this country is the 2nd largest in history. Share with us how depressing this is, but also what role Christians can play in standing up against this Jew hatred that we're seeing today, which is essentially a pandemic.
Okay, firstly, let's understand that these numbers are underreported. For example, I haven't reported an incident of anti-Semitism for years, and I receive an anti-Semitic death threat every single day. You see my inbox, it's horrific. So the numbers, as high as they may be, underestimate the situation. But what I'd say to my Christian friends is this: we're just the front line. In fact, we're not even the front line. Look to your brothers and sisters in Nigeria, through Africa, through Asia. There is a genocide taking place where Christians who are living in Muslim majority countries are facing Islamic terrorism, just like the Jews are facing Islamic terrorism in Israel. And you know, if you take, for example, Bethlehem, 100 years ago, Bethlehem's population was about 80% Christian. It's not anymore. There are only a few Christians left, and they can't tell the truth because they're worried that if they do, their families are going to get persecuted or attacked by the Muslims who are living next door. This is the reality. We are in the same fight here. It may not yet be in your neighborhood. It may not be affecting your church, but it is affecting us. It's affecting other churches, and it needs to be stopped and fought by all of us.
So David Collier, thank you so much for joining us on this week's Behind Headlines. You're doing a great job. Please continue to keep up the fight, and you're doing a great job in exposing the BBC and this fight that we're fighting against Islamic extremism that is a threat to us all. So pray for your safety and that of the Jewish community as well, particularly at this time.
Pleasure to be on.
Thank you, David. Appreciate your work, and we thank you for coming on today. Jonathan S. Tobin, the editor-in-chief of the JNS, wrote this: "The Hamas baby killers and a broken global moral compass. Fashionable anti-Semitism has caused leftist myths about Israeli oppressors to dismiss justified anger and grief about the fate of the Bibas kids. As much as anything else, two little red-haired boys and their mother symbolise the barbaric cruelty of the Hamas assaults on southern Israel on October the 7th. The video of a terrified Shiri clutching her babies, comforting them as they were being pushed away by Hamas terrorists into captivity in Gaza should haunt the conscience of humanity in much the same way as some of the most iconic images of the Holocaust."
Yep, so he goes on to write that now 500 days after the infamous and tragic date, as their fate has been revealed, we also are being forced to come to terms with the extent of the moral failure of the world to respond appropriately to this brazen act of genocidal terrorism. And this is it, isn't it, Tim? And it's like, if the world didn't condemn Hamas enough, or hardly very little condemnation on October the 7th, the fact that this is a new low, the actual murder of a baby and a toddler, and the only reason they were murdered is the fact that they were Jewish. This should cause a moral outrage. I mean, and I think Jonathan Tobis is very correct, creating that moral comparison between what we now know of happened to the Bibas family and the Holocaust. There is a direct symmetry between the two. And so if you saw the horrors of what happened on the continent of Europe 80 years ago, and you remained silent then, of course you're going to remain silent now, aren't you, with what's happened to these to the Bibas family and to the other hostages and to those others that have had their lives taken in the most horrific circumstances back on October the 7th.
Yeah, and I think a major difference is Hamas were live streaming their wickedness. You know, people could see this in real time, and yet at the same time there was still, it's like Holocaust denial but in real time. There were still people, we know on October the 7th they were arranging to march, the anti-Israel lot were arranging on the 7th of October while this was being live streamed. And to see all of that, see some of the things that I've read about in pogroms in the past, and you think that's brutal, that's barbaric, that was medieval times. To see that in 2023 and to see the reaction of the West, it was, I mean, we said it before, it was a real wake-up call.
Absolutely. So going back to this article in the JNS by Jonathan Tobin, he writes, for generations, decent people had wondered how it was that the citizens of what was arguably the most civilized and scientifically advanced society in Europe, Germany, behaved as they did during the Holocaust. And he said the answer was that they didn't believe in the humanity of the Jews. Ordinary Germans looked the other way as their Jewish neighbours were taken and sent to their deaths. The best and brightest of the young men fought to preserve the Nazi regime and/or took part in the slaughter of 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children and millions of other victims. He goes on, the point being is that if you cheer or justify these Hamas baby killers, it isn't just that you're mistaken about the origins and causes of post-October the 7th war, or have been misled by the misinformation about the spread by Palestinians. It seems that you are no different from those ordinary Germans who stood by with the indifference or actually facilitated the Holocaust. It said during the Second World War, the people of the Allied nations instinctively understood there was no moral equivalence between those murdered by German Nazis and their collaborators and the civilians killed as a direct result of military actions that led to the liberation of Europe. But what wise understanding of the nature of war is not shared by much of the liberal leftist elites in public opinion today. He says instead they've accepted the big lies that Israel is committing genocide and Hamas terrorism being justified resistance. And this is where we are, isn't it? It's this indifference and this believing of the Hamas lie as effectively that they are the ones who are the victims, when in reality the truth is that Israel would not have entered into a land incursion into Gaza to destroy Hamas if it wasn't for October the 7th.
Yeah, I was speaking to an Israeli and he said there's this term, it means the same as latte actually, it means upside down. I can't remember what it is in Hebrew, but he was talking about the upside down, the inversion that's going on right now in society, where Israel, who has suffered genocide, is the ones committing genocide. They were called baby killers from the start, and here we have clear evidence of babies being killed by Hamas, and still this silence. Israel gets accused of doing the very things that actually has been done to them. It is a inversion, and as Jonathan writes in JNS, it's the kind of broken moral compass to be found in so many who consider themselves good people. That's a big thing as well. So many people are proud of it. You know, they think they're warriors for justice. They think they're so good, and yet they're standing on the side of evil, and their whole thing is, we love everyone and protect everyone except for the Jewish people, and they make them a scapegoat.
Which is truly shocking. That's why we need to expose them on this programme today. Now, we also see that Melanie Phillips has also written for the JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate, under heading Civilization Weeps. He says here, the terrible fate of the Bibas family and all the other victims of the Gazan Arab depravity symbolises the moral sickness of the West. The Bibas family will remain a symbol of unspeakable evil visited upon Israel on that black day that it continues to confront. It's also a symbol of the West's decadence into inhumanity and his tact endorsement of barbarism. She goes on to say that city after city, people whose faces were contorted with hatred and rage tore down posters of baby Kfir and other hostages from public places. What kind of people feel such hatred and rage at pictures of babies, children, women and men who have been kidnapped by barbaric savages? She says America, Britain and Europe, Canada and Australia have all hosted rampant and blazing anti-Semitic attacks, with their mainstream media prolongating murderous lies about Israel week in, week out. And across last week, its allies continue to deny the excuse that Islamist extremism and Muslim Jew hatred, while denouncing anyone who calls this out as Islamophobia. And again, I think, this is not only involve Israel, because we know that Israel is on the front line in this war against Islamic terrorism and Islamic extremism, but also the fact that if we don't defend Israel, the only democratic outpost in the Middle East that is a beacon of light, then we know that those same evil is going to come after the West, and our Western governments, our Western societies are under a threat from this. And it's time, isn't it, that our Western leaders woke up to the reality, and they know pretty well what that reality is, but they're not willing to confront it, so it grows and gets bigger and more dangerous.
Yeah, in a sense, it feels like people are waking up to this. They are waking up to this slide in our morality. I think people are starting to see, for so long, for example, we had the police trying to cover up or trying to protect these Muslim grooming gangs because they were afraid of being called Islamophobic. Israel is indeed the front line of this war. This Islamism, this extremism, it doesn't just want the Jewish people, it wants everybody, it wants the Christians. In fact, last week, 70 Christians were beheaded in a church in the Congo. 17, it didn't even make the media. Not many people know about this.
And Tim, I think we have to relate this as well to see what's happening in this country, because the Community Security Trust, known as the CST, have published their annual report on anti-Semitic instances recorded in the UK, which sadly is at its second highest ever level. So I'm just going to read from their opening executive statement of their report. So they say that CST recorded 3,528 anti-Semitic instances in the UK in 2024, the second highest total ever reported to the CST in a single calendar year. This is a decrease of 18% from the 4,296 anti-Jewish hate instances recorded by the CST in 2023, which remains the record annual total ever reported. And it was fueled by responses to the October the 7th terror attack by Hamas on Israel that year. CST recorded 1,662 anti-Semitic instances in 2022, 2,261 in 2021, and 1,684 in 2020.
Yeah, it's shocking. The second highest on total. It says here, although the 3,520 anti-Jewish hate incidences recorded in 2024 is a fall from 2023, it's still an unusually large total, 56% higher than the third highest figure, 56% higher. It is a reflection of the sustained levels of anti-Semitism that have been recorded across the UK since October the 7th. And as David was saying as well, remember this is massively underreported, particularly, you know, online anti-Semitism, and a lot of people choose not to report it for whatever reason. I think they're so used to it now. But I can tell you this, a lot of Jewish people that I speak to, so many of them have personally said they've experienced it since October the 7th.
Yeah, no, it's horrific. I mean, the CST also go on to report that they recorded 201 instances in the category of assault in 2024, decrease from 26% from 273 reported in 2023, and the second highest total in this category for any calendar year. They say that there was one additional instance severe enough to be classified as extreme violence, meaning involved grievous bodily harm or threat to life, whereas none of the previous year. Taken together, physical attacks on the Jewish people constitute 6% of the annual total in 2024, the same as 2023.
Yeah, and when you consider actually 2023, October the 7th happened, you know, towards the end of the year, it was frightening how much anti-Semitism was there. But actually, the assaults, you hear about school children having bottles thrown at them, cases of damage as well and desecration to Jewish property, it says in the report, fell by 19% from 2023. But again, it's the second highest annual figure in this category. These are all record-breaking figures. It's frightening.
Absolutely. And of course, the context of their report is that October the 7th took them all by surprise. And the scale of Jew hatred that erupted out of those mass terrorist attacks by Hamas is actually indicament of the figures that they quoted for 2023. Now, considering that Israel's been at war with Hamas for over a year in 2024, and of course, this is then mean that this is the second largest report of recorded instances of Jewish hatred in the history of the CST and in the history of these annual reports on Jew hatred. And of course, what we've seen really is from 2021, as you're saying, this steep incline. It's only dropped a bit because of the scale of what happened in 2023, but still it's the second highest on record. I mean, these figures are enough to make Jewish people think that they want to make Aliyah. And we know that our government and our society are not doing enough to actually crack down on this Jew hatred. But surely as well is that our churches need to be educated on the importance of God's plans and purposes for Israel and the Jewish people. Our churches should be speaking out against this Jew hatred and actually not to hear any condemnation of Hamas through the brutal murder of the Bibas, Kfir and Ariel is shocking. I wonder how many churches up and down the country even mentioned the horrific murder of Ariel and Kfir and their mother Shiri Bibas at the hands of Hamas.
it is shocking. October 7th, listen, it uncovered something that was already there. And, you know, we have talked about politicians and the media, but you're actually bang on the church leaders. We should have spiritual discernment. We should have this, I mean, number one, we should have a familial connection with the Jewish people. After all, you know, it was Jewish apostles that preached the gospel. Yeshua is the root and offspring of David, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. All of that aside, when you look at our nation, and this is sad for me, when you look at our nation in the 19th century, first part of the 20th century, the Christians were very much Zionist. They very much believed and prayed for Israel. We had Christians in Parliament like Lord Shaftesbury, and you know, we've come so far. When you think now that Christians are silent on this, and they found it easy, a lot of these pastors found it easy to put a black square on for when George Floyd was murdered, or to put the Ukrainian flag up. When it comes to the worst pogrom massacre against Israel, I mean, this isn't even a complicated issue. This is clear as black and white, and the silence is deafening. So
we see that the campaign against anti-Semitism told the JNS, over the past year, anti-Semitic hate crimes have quadrupled. Jews are now the most targeted faith minority in this country. Despite our minuscule numbers, a spokesman for the campaign against anti-Semitism told the JNS at this time. With extremism changing our country before our eyes, we know that safety of our Jewish community is not something that we can take for granted. But share with us, as a pastor and as a father, Tim, how Christians should have a moral anger and indignation about the way that the Bibas family were treated at the hands of Hamas, because clearly the residents of Gaza are not innocent of this. I mean, there's one interesting quote, I think. How many residents of Gaza protected the Jewish hostages, and how many of them helped them escape? The fact is that none of them have done that.
Yeah, I mean, in Nazi Germany, there were Germans that helped Jewish children, there were Germans that helped Jewish people. There's not been one incident. Even Israel was offering rewards, millions of dollars, and people were still not helping. It was actually civilians. A lot of civilians did a lot of the kidnapping and hosting, keeping the hostages in their homes. That was civilians. And, you know, when you have this false equivalence between what's Hamas and Israel, Israel is a country responding. Hamas is the government of that country. And for example, if France was to attack us like that, we would expect our government to defend us but this equivalence and this constant pointing the finger at Israel and accusing Israel. I just want to point out one more thing from the CST records. It says 1,240 cases of online anti-Semitism. I can tell you that's a tiny percentage. You know, probably David gets more than that in a year. You know, it's incredible.
But share with us our response as Christians to this. Not only the horrific murder of the Bibas family, but also, which has shocked Israel, but also the latest Community Security Trust report on anti-Semitism, that this is the second highest recording in history.
Listen, this is also an opportunity for Christians to show that we stand with the Jewish people, that we love them, we have a debt of gratitude. It's so easy. Just say, to hold a banner that says Christians stand with Israel, praying for you. Write letters to the rabbis.
Absolutely. Tim, it's been great having you on Behind Headlines. You've done a great job. Thank you so much. And thank you for being a pastor that has moral clarity in standing up for Israel and the Jewish people at this very critical time in our nation's history and the history of the world. And we want to thank you for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines. I think we need moral outrage at the evil and the brutality that Hamas committed against the Bibas family. Poor Kfir Bibas, a 10-year-old baby, and his older brother, who was 4, Ariel, murdered by their captors, by Hamas, including their mother Shiri, and then not to have their mother return with them is a crime against humanity. This is a crime against the Jewish people, and it's time that the church remains silent no longer. So thank you for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines.